Hi, I'm Aubrie.
Hi, I'm Kathleen. We're two friends having a good time.
I happen to be a Christian, and that's okay.
And I happen to be an atheist, and that's okay.
Welcome to the Christian and the Atheist podcast.
Let's dive in.
Hey guys, have you left a review for our podcast yet? Head over to wherever you listen to your podcast and do that right now.
And follow us on Instagram and Facebook at The Christian and the Atheist, and TikTok at Christian and Atheist.
Check us out on Patreon for ad-free content.
And speaking of ads, if you or your business would like to sponsor the Christian and the Atheist podcast, feel free to contact us to get started.
Coming up on the Christian and the Atheist podcast.
I'm fascinated by your work. I read the articles and I was like, this is like a whole world of knowledge that I didn't realize was really an area of study. And now I'm going to sign up for your classes.
And I have a particular interest in the marginalization of atheists, in the rise of Christian nationalism. I looked at inaugural addresses from World War II up until Trump. And I did a larger project where I was just looking at how presidents talked about atheists. And spoiler alert, it wasn't very nice. A lot of people are atheists. That number is growing. And how can we recognize that atheists are just as equally good citizens as people who believe in God?
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Christian and the Atheist podcast. Today we are with an amazing lady who, she contacted both Kathleen and I about being a guest on the podcast because she's the assistant professor at the University of South Dakota. Hi, Kristina.
Hi.
So I loved whenever we got your email and you were like, I love your podcast and I teach students about, what's it called? The theist normativity. Mm-hmm. And I was like, never heard of that. And
because I made it up.
Yeah. Well, there's another lady who made up a word and it ended up in the dictionary and it was bootylicious Beyonce.
That's so great.
So if you want to be in that category, I'm here for it. So anyways, something that was great was you sent us some articles that you have written about atheism and stuff. But we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we do dive into all the exciting things, I wanted to have you give us an intro to who you are.
Yeah, so I'm a professor in communication studies, and my specialty is looking at religious and political rhetoric. So really how the language we use shapes our understanding of the world. And I have a particular interest in the marginalization of atheists, in the rise of Christian nationalism over the last really 200 years is what I look at. But really I'm also ultimately the goal of my research is creating more productive interfaith dialogue that relies heavily on understanding empathy, trying to understand people's experiences, trying to put language to people's experiences. And especially that's where the idea of theist normativity comes from, is trying to explain what it can feel like being an atheist, where people kind of constantly assume you're a theist and there's a lot of pressure to pretend like you believe in God, and kind of how that shapes our ideas of what religious freedom mean and what it looks like in our society.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. I am the a-hole that always is everybody's Christian. It took having conversations with Kathleen to be like.
Well, it's one of those things that if you aren't aware of it, walking through the grocery store, the clerk says, "God bless" as you walk out. And that's not offensive or mean. It's a nice sentiment. It's lovely. But at the same time, you're like, I mean, cool, I guess. I don't know. And
Yep.
The amount of times as an atheist that just walking through our town, I am assumed to be a Christian, and not just a believing, a faithful person, but just a Christian. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. Once I left Christianity and became an atheist, I really started to pay attention to it and be like, wow, everybody thinks this. Everybody thinks this way. So it's really interesting. And I'm fascinated by your work. I read the articles and I was like, this is a whole world of knowledge that I didn't realize was really an area of study. And now I'm going to sign up for your classes. So.
Love it. Please do.
Wow.
I mean, not really. I don't want to go to college again.
I know, right?
But
I will say we have gotten contacted by a lot of people telling us to read their stuff, and
yes.
you're like the one we actually read.
Well, thank you.
Just out of like, that's a lot, but yours were great. They were very like thought provoking, even for me, and it's eye opening to see. And one of the articles that you brought up or sent us was about the inaugural. What's that word?
The inaugural address. From presidents. Yep.
So sorry.
Like
they're very faith-based toward, like, they're trying to pull at your feelings, and of course, which if you're smart, you do that. And usually it's on a religious stance, and it's like, oh my gosh. And like, so can you talk about that article really quick? Because that one's the one that kind of gave us an intro to like your way of thinking and the theist normativity, and go from there. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was this article I wrote. I looked at inaugural addresses from World War II up until Trump, and I did a larger project where I was just looking at how presidents talked about atheists, and spoiler alert, it wasn't very nice. But what I found really interesting when I was doing that research was they really don't talk about atheists very often, but what they do tend to do is talk about the American people as this like theistic collective. So the idea of like, we're a God-fearing people, we're a God-loving people, making references to a higher power and kind of presuming the audience will agree, saying something like, now will all Americans join me in prayer, which kind of just presents this idea that good citizenship is understood as being involved with a belief in a higher power. And while there's oftentimes this implication that it's the Christian God, they kind of have to be very strategic to tend to use more broad terms so that it's not obviously just about the Christian God, but it still excludes atheists in these conversations. So it kind of brings into questions of, how do we in a society recognize that, yes, the majority of Americans do believe in God, but a lot of people are atheists, and that number is growing. And how can we recognize that atheists are just as equally good citizens as people who believe in God? And that's been a really big interest of mine, is just seeing how certain narratives in politics kind of reinforce this image of the God-believing American and the implications for that for atheist Americans.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought was very interesting was you brought up in that article specifically, but you brought up how being an atheist in a political sense is almost tied to being un-American. That if you're not going to church every Sunday and praying and thinking this way, then you are equated almost to a communist or a somebody who is just trying to tear down the nation. And then the other thing you brought up that was interesting is, which I've encountered so many times, but the idea that the only thing keeping you a good moral person is Christianity only. And if you erase Christianity from your life, then you are suddenly a degenerate who has no morals at all. And so it's that's definitely something that I've encountered in my own experiences as an atheist. Yeah,
that's definitely one thing that probably is what drew me to want to research this. Was I grew up religious and very kind of slowly left religion. I didn't have any really negative experiences though, like with the church. So I didn't have any resentment towards religion. But then when I became an open atheist, people's responses were incredibly negative, oftentimes, or I would find myself regularly in situations where people were assuming I was religious, and I had to decide whether to correct them. And as soon as I did, they would oftentimes turn a little bit like, well, what stops you from killing somebody? And you're like, I don't want to go to jail. I don't know. Things like that. Or people like immediately turning that into debates, or people saying that my mom was a bad mom because I became an atheist. Like these types of narratives that came out, that was just like, this seems very unwelcoming. And I understand why a lot of atheists choose not to be open about it. And so I was just really interested in thinking about, what is it about our culture that really reinforces these ways of thinking, and how then can we kind of resist this way of thinking?
What do you think it is about the culture that's causing this?
Well, I think that a lot of it has to do with Christian nationalism, and that's a lot of people kind of talk about the rise of Christian nationalism, but a lot of the work that I do on it looks at how Christian nationalism is as ingrained in US culture as things like patriarchy, white supremacy, heteronormativity. If we look to a lot of the cultural norms of the early 1800s, for example, Christian nationalism is kind of seeped into those. For example, in the United States, blasphemy laws were very common. You could not openly critique Christianity specifically. And those weren't deemed unconstitutional until the 1950s. So it's only been 70 years that blasphemy laws were considered unconstitutional.
That's so embarrassing.
Yeah, well, and just lots of things like there's in a lot of states, atheists couldn't run for public office. They weren't allowed to vote in some places. And those have eventually gone away. But even the public office one, that wasn't considered unconstitutional till the 1960s, 1970s. And there are still 7 states that have in their constitutions that atheists can't hold public office. And while they couldn't actually uphold that, people will try to invoke those clauses when atheists run.
Yeah.
And it's those types of kind of old norms from the early 1800s, when there was a very strong anti-atheism in the United States, that are still kind of part of what we kind of call our public memory without us even realizing it. And then I think the rise of communism in particular, and the way that particularly in US politics, politicians in the 1950s made a very strategic choice to kind of frame this as a war of morality, of the atheistic communism against the theistic believers in God. In the 1950s is when we got under God into the Pledge of Allegiance. That was added then. "In God We Trust" became our national motto in 1957, I think it was. "In God We Trust" got put on all of our money. So we start seeing these norms that kind of seem like, oh, this is what it means to be American. But a lot of them kind of stem from these anti-atheist movements that were designed to make people think of Americans as theists and atheists as un-American.
Interesting.
Can you really fast, just for our audience, give us a quick definition of the word theist normativity? What does that mean?
Yeah, so theist normativity in its broadest sense is the way that belief in God is kind of seen as the default. It is the norm. We presume that people believe in God. We presume that belief in God is a natural state that people do immediately. And also, like my area in particular looks at how the belief in God is tied to ideals of good citizenship, of successful democracy, this idea that you can't have a successful democracy unless society believes in God. It's very closely tied to, there's another term called Christonormativity, which is the normalization of Christianity specifically. But theist normativity sometimes is a way to use those same narratives, but still seem more inclusive of so that's for something like "In God We Trust" or "Under God," for example. When those were added, the politicians behind that very much argued we're not promoting one religion, which most people, when they hear that, they do think the Christian God, but they were able to use kind of the vague use of God to seem inclusive, but then atheists were still kind of, it was okay to exclude them from society. So it's kind of the way that those norms get created and the way we kind of then tie belief in God as the norm in society.
So can you give us some examples of, I know you sort of did a little bit, but can you kind of go a little deeper into some of the ways that atheists are marginalized in the United States specifically? I know we have, some states where they can't run for office, or people are trying to keep them from running for office. Are there any other things that you've, learned as you study this topic?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important kind of point of, things have definitely gotten a lot better. There's been a really strong, really interesting movement in the atheist secular community to really fight for atheist rights. That's the reason we don't have blasphemy laws. It's the reason those state laws are unconstitutional. But some ways that it definitely still kind of manifests is through the stereotypes that kind of frame atheists as untrustworthy, as problematic. So just for a couple of examples, things like custody cases. If one parent is an atheist and the other is a Christian, the Christian parent is more likely to get custody based off of the idea that you'll teach the children more morals, things like that. And court cases are actually a really big one. So there's been a lot of studies that have been done that have found that in the United States, it's the default to say, "So help me God," in an oath. And you do have the legal right to refuse to have an alternative. But studies have found that if you choose to do that, you have to say it and say that you want an alternative, and then jurors are less likely to believe you. So things like that, where you're just like less likely to be believed. And this can be pretty extreme cases. There was another recent study that was done that found that if you had somebody who was a Christian versus somebody who did not mention their religious views versus somebody who was an atheist who are talking about being sexually assaulted, and it's just revealed, and all that's revealed is that, before they were assaulted, they went to a Christian club, organized youth meeting, something like that. Nothing was mentioned. They went to an atheist meeting. The atheist was far less likely to be believed that they were actually assaulted. And so it's just like things about being trusted. In the parts of the country, if you have something to indicate that you're an atheist on your resume, you're less likely to get called in for an interview. And so there's just a lot of pressure for atheists to hide their atheist identities because there might be social or economic changes. There's a lot of interesting correlation between things like atheists being kicked out of their homes from their families refusing to pay for their school if they find out that they're atheists, things like that. If you're a politician, you cannot be an open atheist and run at the national level. At the local level, depending on the area, it's going to make a big difference. There's some areas that are much more open to that. But it definitely creates some challenges if you're an open atheist trying to run for politics. So it's things like that are more subtle, but they really pressure people to hide their atheism.
Well, I know in my own life, like I said earlier, if somebody says in the checkout line, "Oh, I hope you have a blessed day," I say, "Oh, thanks, you too." I don't say like, "Oh, I'm not religious." And even, we had, first of all, it's just easy to just like, "Great, bye."
Yeah.
But even we had my 14-year-old daughter on the show who she obviously, being raised in a non-religious household, she is not religious at all. She claims herself as an atheist. And, she talked about how she plays volleyball, and a good portion of her volleyball team are Christian, and they do things like pray before every match. And she just goes along with it. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't want to rock the boat because she knows that there is a possibility that if she comes out as an atheist to this group of very devout Christians, is she going to get as much playtime? Is she going to get benched? Probably not, but that is definitely something she thinks about.
Yeah, and that's a really common, like one of the critiques with, recently there's been a Supreme Court case about whether coaches can pray. And this is one of the big questions of, you might say, oh, there's not going to be punishment, but there's always that fear, which is why a lot of times things like that of having this those group prayers, something like that, atheists oftentimes do feel the pressure to pass because them just saying like, oh, actually I'm not religious, so I'm going to sit this one out. Like in theory, I would like to think that would just be, oh, I just want to have my views respected and be different. But that's oftentimes read as an attack and critique of the religion. Yeah. So even if someone says like, oh, God bless, if you're like, oh, I'm actually not religious, but I hope you have a great day. Like that oftentimes is taken as being the aggressor because you're the one who brought up the challenge. But I was like, I was just trying to be like, prevent this assumption and try to challenge that assumption. But it's oftentimes it's read as very aggressive. And that's one thing I'm really interested in is how do you overcome the kind of theistnormativity and Christonormativity, because challenging it is kind of automatically read as being aggressive, even if it's done in the most respectful way possible.
Yeah. Do you have any ideas for that? Because that was going to be my next question.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just to many ways, it's a matter of recognizing your own positionality of, in each situation, deciding how safe it is to come out, how mentally prepared you to have this conversation. Like I'll do on plane rides. I love doing this on plane rides and having this conversation with people when something comes up, because it's like, we've got a solid hour or two to talk about it. But then if it goes badly, we're gone. I'm never going to see you again.
Never see you.
Right? In a checkout line, you probably don't have time to like really go into the conversations, but it can be kind of interesting to disrupt that norm. Yeah. So it's kind of, I think it's very much a personal preference. Talking about it with friends is a really great way to be like, hey, I noticed that you did this. Have you ever thought about how that person might not have been religious? Yeah. Or I think one thing that my mom is Christian, and one thing she's really started doing is like when someone like passes away, instead of saying my thoughts and prayers are with you, she'll just say my thoughts are with you, unless she knows with 100% certainty that person is a Christian, because that's another big conversation, is the way that when you are not religious, like people dealing with death is sometimes a really interesting time where people tend to push their religion on you a little bit more.
Yeah.
And it can be very emotionally exhausting. And it's like, on one hand, I think you're trying to be nice, but sometimes it also feels like you're using my pain to push your religion. And like, how do you kind of handle that in a way that's tactful, but also you're emotionally exhausted already because you're dealing with the high emotion of that. And so I think it's just one of those situations of deciding for yourself, like recognizing when you put yourself out there, there's a good chance someone is going to react very negatively. Sometimes in more extreme cases. I just listened to the podcast about the bar fight. That's a great example where, I think the fact that you were like, oh, I'm not, many people would have just said, sure, yes, I'm religious, just to, not deal with it.
Yeah.
Saying that I'm not religious can be really powerful in bringing up powerful conversations. But if someone takes it really negatively, in the most extreme cases, it can turn, in some cases, violent, unfortunately.
Yeah, it can get scary if you're not in a safe situation with someone you trust. It can be very scary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
that makes me sad.
Yeah.
It's not a reality that I have to face because of my religious belief system, and to know that people that I care about, like Kathleen and then you, Kristina, having to think about these types of things. It's like Christianity is supposed to be peaceful and full of love, and yet we've created this space that you two having stories of having to consider saying something or not, and if your safety's on the line, like, and it's Christianity versus and I'm like, oh my gosh, something's not working out right here. You know what I mean? Like, it feels a little icky.
Yeah.
So,
and I do think it's interesting. I think there's, especially, obviously we're American, we're talking about America. I'm sure there are other countries that face very similar issues, but I do think it's very interesting the tie-in that Christianity has with American. Being an American is being a God-fearing, my husband and I actually had had a little discussion about this a few days ago about how, there has the conversation of gun control has become almost a conversation of Christianity. In some places, in some people's minds, it is my God-given right to own a gun and do what I want with it. So if the government tries to take my guns, like you see people T-shirts that say like God, guns, whatever, and
in
you're like,
God we trust, and we have the right to bear arms because
like, and so it is interesting that this the Christian angle seeps into different topics of conversation when it comes to politics. It's really fascinating. I kind of went down like a little rabbit hole of your presentations and your articles, and like, oh, my brain was like growing all kind. I was like, this is crazy. But yeah,
and I think, and that's such an important part of the conversation too, of recognizing, like, when we talk about Christian nationalism being tied to politics, and we're not talking about Christianity necessarily, because not all Christians are Christian nationalists. And I mean, there are atheists who are Christian nationalists, and that's how like deeply this kind of mindset is. There are atheists who agree that believing in God makes you a better citizen, because that narrative has been so deeply ingrained. And a lot of times with the Christian nationalism, it oftentimes does get tied to other conservative values. There's a lot of overlap sometimes with the Christian national discourse and the white supremacist discourses. And a lot of that can go, if we go really back far into history, there was a series of the Catholic Church passed several doctrines. There's one, it's called the Doctrine of Discovery, in which they declared that any land that is uninhabited by Christians is discoverable. And it kind of erased the way that, there are Native Americans living in places, indigenous people, and because they were pagans, heathens, using the language of the church at the time, like, they weren't as good of, they didn't really have the right to inhabit the land in the same way that Christians did. And with Christians, we kind of thought about like white people in particular. And there's this very long kind of old history of how the Doctrine of Discovery got kind of tied into white supremacy. And so there's still a lot of those connections. Even when we hear Christian nationalist discourses today, those get really deeply then tied into other kind of, oftentimes like narratives of violence, such as some of the gun narratives. So, yeah.
I recently heard somebody who, it was a gross conversation, but it was somebody who, it was like online, and they were talking about slavery and sort of justifying it using the same type of idea that at least when the African people were brought here as slaves, they were given Christianity, so that slavery wasn't as bad because then they became saved. And I was like, oh,
what the heck?
Yeah. And that's the exact, if you look at the Doctrine of Discovery, the way that this was justified actually by the Supreme Court in the 1820s was that we took land from Native Americans, but they've been duly compensated because we gave them civilization and Christianity.
Yeah.
And that's like, that is how a Supreme Court justice in the United States justified taking land from Native Americans. And so that narrative is, and people still use that a lot, unfortunately, to justify some pretty horrific crimes that have been done, in the name of the United States, using white supremacy, all of those things, or in the name of Christianity. So,
yeah, it is. It's, there's all kinds of ways you could, once you understand that idea, that was, such a big part of people's minds at that time, it's really easy to then say, okay, now I understand why we had residential schools for Native kids. And now I understand why the, go West young man, why we were so okay with this whole mindset. It really makes a lot of sense when you start piecing together the history. It's way easier to understand where we are now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's always important to recognize we've made so much progress in the United States in terms of equality and tolerance. But unfortunately, these are still parts of our history that do have ripple effects. Yeah. That, there's still elements of those laws that are still part of our laws, that, the precedents in the Supreme Court. There's still narratives that we hear, the idea of the United States as God's chosen nation. That's one that's very deeply tied to, if it's God's chosen nation, it can justify doing anything because we're on God's side, right? And if we're on God's side, it's got to be the right side. And so those types of narratives get really deeply ingrained in our culture in ways that can sometimes become really toxic. Yeah. And again, this isn't to say that Christianity is necessarily toxic. It's to say that these manifestations of how they work in power relations and politics can be.
Right.
I think something that, from my point of view, is being Christian and being, like, you grew up in church, both of you did. So you guys know what it is to be sit down and talk to your entire life indoctrinated into this belief system that this is the one way, this is the one belief, and this is what's real. And nobody should be able to take this away from you. And then I think that's kind of like why they're trying to make it Christian nationalism, where it's getting into the politics, is because they're like, this is what God wants. And it's like, I think the part that is super unfair to the rest of the world is saying it's the one way, because I think at my personal faith journey and my personal grasp on God is not Christianity is the only way for every single human being on this planet. That to me is ignorant and silly and disrespectful to God's creation from my perspective. So I think the reason why a lot of people dig their nails so deep in this belief of this is how it has to be. We cannot let people kill babies in women's wombs. So we got to allow policy change to keep it from happening. It's I think it's because of this sick thinking of this is it. This is what we have to pass on to generation after generation and to all the nations. It's please let that go. So
I always think it'd be so, if everyone could, I identify as an agnostic atheist, so I don't believe in a higher power, but I'm agnostic in the sense of that I'm willing to admit that I don't know. I'm I wish that if everyone was just add agnostic to whatever their title is, it would make it much healthier conversations. But I guess I wanted to just another point you kind of bringing up is one of the things I really try to emphasize when teaching interfaith dialogues is trying to develop empathy, even in cases where it feels really frustrating. So with Christian nationalists, obviously, I have very big concerns about how Christian nationalism is a danger to democracy, particularly because it really limits religious freedom. But I also try to be empathetic in recognizing that for many people who are Christian nationalists, they genuinely believe that they are trying to promote God's will. And if we don't do God's will, God will punish the nation and it's a danger to our society. So they genuinely and even if I strongly disagree with that, right, I can try to understand oh, you genuinely believe that what you're doing is trying to save society. So one of the things that what I try to do in the research that I do is emphasize but here are the negative consequences of Christian nationalism.
Nice.
Here is how you're literally preventing other people from having religious freedom. Are you saying we want to be a Christian nation? You hear that a lot from politicians.
Yeah.
We need to go back and be a Christian nation. We moved away from that. So, okay, do you want to go back to a time where people can be thrown in prison or fined for critiquing Christianity? Do you want to go back to a time where if you were not Christian, you could be denied the right to vote or run for office? And this wasn't just atheists. There were Catholics weren't, because Catholics were considered Christian in kind of the early 1800s, that narrative that there's a huge tension between Protestants and Christians. There's a very long history of denying people freedom that we've had to fight for the last 200 years. And so calls to go back to being a Christian nation without realizing it is erasing this history of religious intolerance that unfortunately we don't learn about a lot in the United States. And so we have to know that history to not repeat it.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
What is the most surprising thing once you started studying this? What's something that surprised you that you learned?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of it was that history of religious intolerance, because I feel like we were always kind of taught, the United States was founded on the principle of religious freedom. That is a narrative we hear from early ages. But if you really look at the history, that's not really true. It was grounded on the idea of religious freedom for Christians, but that religious freedom did not oftentimes, frankly, just did not translate to non-Christians. And there's just a very long history of that being a value we really had to fight for. And, learning things, I mentioned the blasphemy laws was a big one. When under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and it was justified by arguing that an atheist American is a contradiction of terms, so it doesn't matter that they can't say the pledge. Those types of narratives, and you're just these are not just benign narratives that don't mean anything. They are deeply ingrained in our, and we can look at them and really understand how religious intolerance spreads, and thinking about how, as a society today, can we make sure we don't go back to that negative history. And again, I'm just always so amazed at how I didn't learn so much of this history at any point. And most people I talk to have no idea that under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, for example. And people who are atheists tend to know that, but other people are usually quite shocked by that.
Yeah.
Or that In God We Trust was put on coins during the Civil War. Another one that I find really fascinating is there's a group that is still active today called the National Reform Association that has been trying since the mid-1800s to pass an amendment called the Christian Amendment that would change our Constitution to say we recognize Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, and bestower of our gifts. And they were the same group. A lot of those members were the same ones who got In God We Trust on coins, who got under God in pledge. So seeing kind of how this movement has evolved, how they rely oftentimes on more vague theist normative discourses because it's a little easier to get past. And so you can see kind of the potential problematization of those terms. I just think learning that history has just been so fascinating to me. And it's something that every time I go into archives, I just find something new where I'm just like, what? Someone said that?
Yeah.
How?
Yep.
Yeah.
It does. It makes, the idea of Christian nationalism makes me very nervous because there is a subset of them that do think, yes, we should go back to where atheists can't vote. Yes, we should go back to where if you are not a Christian, you aren't allowed to be part of this country. And that scares me because not only for atheists, but people of other faiths that are not Christian, that we have a large group in America that doesn't fall into this little category. And the best thing we can do is learn from each other instead of try to banish each other. And so it's nerve-wracking. Those conversations are always like, oh. Yeah. But yeah.
So what are ways that Christians and other religious people can keep from marginalizing atheists?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones is recognizing the stereotypes, right? There are the stereotypes of the angry atheist is a big one, or the distrustful atheist, the immoral atheist, all of those types of things. research has continually shown that atheists are no more likely to commit crimes. They're no more likely to lie. And so kind of taking a step back and being like, why do I have these negative feelings about atheists, and are they really true, right? So I think that's a really big one, is just trying to challenge those stereotypes and sometimes our own ways of thinking that can be very deeply ingrained in ourselves. Another one would be to invite atheists to conversations. That's a big part of the issue. Like, I do a lot of work in interfaith dialogues, and a lot of times with interfaith dialogues, atheists are just not even invited at all. And it's like they actually have something to say too, right? To this, they can contribute to these conversations in really insightful ways. So that's definitely a really big one. I think another one is taking the time to understand why particular atheist activists, or just atheists in general, act the way that they do. And so, for example, I was at a really interesting interfaith event one time, and it was mostly religious people. There were a few of us atheists there were talking, and then there was a kind of a pastor who was overseeing it all. And one of the Christians in the group was like, I just don't understand why atheists have to be so angry all the time and so mean and rude. It's really frustrating. And the pastor stepped in and he was like, well, have you ever thought about like why atheists are upset? Have you ever asked atheists why they're angry? And like this kid was like super confused. And then he's like, so the atheists in the room, can you talk about some things? So then there were people who talked about like the trauma they experienced in churches. They talked about those negative experiences. They talked about how like frustrating some of their experiences have been when, you know, people have tried to debate them and have gone really aggressive, or like one person there had been forced to go to like a really intensive Christian camp that was really traumatizing for them. They talked about those experiences. And so I think like those are really like this particular person, like actually then hearing these stories of like, oh, like we're not like people aren't angry for no reason, right? There's usually a reason. So trying to find out what that is, you know, when things like, if atheists choose to challenge under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, for example, people will oftentimes very quickly be like, oh, you know, this is really pointless. There's no need for this. You're just causing problems for no reason. You're unpatriotic. You're un-American. But if you're like, okay, well, why don't you like this phrase? And you actually learn about the history and like why people are like, I know I want to say a loyalty pledge to my country. I'm proud. You know, I want to be American. I can't say a pledge that was altered under the justification that an atheist American is a contradiction of terms. Like that feels gross, right?
Right.
And so actually like taking the time to ask, okay, I don't agree with what you're doing. I don't agree with what your approach, but let me ask why you're taking the approach that you are. I think that can be really powerful in just helping to humanize people. And I think that's really powerful in having those interfaith conversations, which is why I love podcasts like this.
Yeah, I wanted to say I have to agree so much on that, just out of the experience I've had with talking to Kathleen. Like when Roe v. Wade was overturned, Kathleen was outraged. I was outraged, by the way. Yes.
We have opinions about that one.
And Kathleen said, it's so messed up that I have to be a part of a country that's got this faith base and is making like revoking this because of the people's like Christianity. And I don't even subscribe to that belief system, and I have to abide by this bullshit. So I'm like, oh my God, you're right. How unfair for you. Because it's like, I subscribe to this belief system and my freaking peers are over here doing this, but I don't have that perspective. So when I heard that and I was like, damn, that's messed up. And so I agree, listening to it softened me quite a bit from, like, I just never thought of it that way. And anyway, so and like you said, there's this type of a podcast with her Kathleen being atheist and I'm Christian, I think. Sorry. Anyways.
I do think, you know, having conversations with people, we've learned so much over the years of doing this show. There are so people important that we go to have on our show and we're like, we already know we don't like what this person is going to say. And then we sit down and have a conversation with them and go, wait a second, they're making some good points. They, you know,
sometimes
maybe we still don't end up, sometimes. We may not agree. We may not walk away from the conversation like, well, changing my view. But having a conversation with somebody and actually listening, and like you said, empathy can go miles and make life so much better for everybody involved. Once
And like
you,
both sides, like you and I have had to have empathy towards a guest that neither one of us were like, but he had great things to say. And it's just taking time to like allow for that space, like allow space for people. And I feel like what you said about how like be curious about why people are angry, and that pastor saying that to the kid that was like, why are y'all always so angry? It's something that my therapist has said to me before. It's like, be curious as to why you're angry, or why someone is presenting anger towards you. And so I think that is a good point to be made.
Okay, so, you know, in discourses, we talk about privilege a lot. There's obviously white privilege, male privilege. What about Christian privilege? What are some of the things that Christians don't realize that they are privileged about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, privilege is always one of those questions that people can be really tricky sometimes, because I think one of the things when it comes to privilege is recognizing, especially when you're the majority or historically you're part of a group that has had the most power, which in the United States, Christianity has been, there are just elements that you don't even have to think about. So one example is like being able to find a community space. So when I first moved to the town I live in now, it's a town about 10,000 people. And the real estate agent I was working with, I told her I study religion and politics. I usually just start with that to keep things safe. And she immediately assumed that I was religious without me saying that. And she was like, oh, well, we have every possible church you can imagine. We just don't have a synagogue or a mosque. And I was like, okay, so you have every Christian church you can imagine. And it's true. This town has tons of Christian churches. And there's nothing wrong with having a lot of options in Christian churches. But that means that when Christians move to this town, they have a lot of options to try to find a community space that's good for them. But if you are not a Christian, whether you're atheist, Jewish, Muslim, you might have no options or only one option. And if that's not a good fit, too bad, so sad. Maybe you can drive an hour or 2 hours to try to find a space, but like just being able to find a sense of community is a really big one. Another one is thinking about like our calendar is built around Christian holidays. It's very rare that if you are a Christian that you will have to work or go to school on your Christian holidays. And there was just actually, I believe it's in California right now, there is a debate about adding the Muslim holiday of Eid to the calendar. And it was initially added, but then there was so much pushback that it got taken off again. And it's this idea of like, you know, just allowing other people to have their major religious tradition recognizing the holidays so that they don't have to miss school or don't have to use vacation days to get off work, things like that. Like that's something that Christians are going to do without it necessarily thinking about most of the time. And of course there's exceptions with some jobs, but generally it's not something you have to necessarily think about at all. You can assume that everybody else knows your major holidays or know the basics of your religion without having to learn about other religious traditions. Things like that. I think that those are all aspects of, you can kind of go back to even like clubs, for example. Like there's so many Christian clubs like on my campus, which are all great and they all meet different things. I don't think there's any atheist clubs. I'm on the board of a group called the Secular Student Alliance, which is an atheist organization. And a lot of times they are the only atheist group on a campus that students even have the choice to use, and they very strategically use secular instead of atheist because atheists can cause some tension sometimes, and even then they sometimes get pushback where they have to really fight to get the club going because it's just like, I don't know if we can allow to have an atheist group on campus, and it's like, well, you've got like 3 Christian groups on campus already, or high schools or whatever it is. It's like, so it's like those types of things that a lot of times Christians don't necessarily, like there's just obstacles sometimes for religious minorities or atheists that Christians don't necessarily even have to think about. To me, like the best example of Christian privilege though is the whole like war on Christmas narrative. Because like to me, like so much of what's so interesting about the Christian privilege is that, and what makes particularly talking about it difficult is there's such a strong Christian persecution narrative of the idea that Christians are under attack. Christians are under attack. If you really look at it, it's Christian privilege that is that is under attack in the way that we're trying to get equality. So when people are like, how dare you say happy holidays, say Merry Christmas. you're saying, how dare you include everybody and not explicitly just talk about my religion? Like, that's the epitome of privilege, is to view a statement like Happy Holidays that's inclusive of everybody as a war on your religion. Right. And so trying to just so much of, I think, thinking about Christian privilege is thinking about, okay, what are just ways that other religions don't have the same experience as me, and taking that time to be like, oh, actually, like, they're not fighting to attack my religion. They're fighting to have the same rights as my religion, or if they're taking away something from us, it's because they're trying to create equality, right? Of like, okay, if you aren't allowed, and if other religions aren't allowed to do this, then Christians shouldn't be allowed to do this, or whatever it is. And those are really tricky. Conversations of equality are always tricky, but it doesn't have to be viewed as an attack on the religion. It's about we're trying to balance how to handle religious equality, religious freedom, and that's tricky. And that's just a really important part of those conversations, is that self-reflection there.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think people, again, we've had conversations with Satanists, and the Church of Satan does a lot of work doing that sort of thing when say a religious group wants to put a statue at the courthouse, the Church of Satan says, okay, cool, we're gonna put one too. and that's when everybody suddenly's like, oh wait, we should separate church and state. We can't put religious statues anymore.
Which happened in Oklahoma.
And that's the whole point of the organization. And again, there's a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes that people, specifically Christian people, have towards this group that are mostly atheists that are just trying to create equality for the most part. And there's obviously exceptions to every rule, and there's always people in each group that need to calm down, but for the most part, I think it's interesting. It's the conversations that when you actually sit down and talk to people who are in a different group than you just learn what it means to be that person a little more, and the empathy grows. So
well, and I think that's such an important part of any kind of speaking across difference, but especially interfaith dialogue, is we have a tendency to judge our group by the best of our group and the other group by the worst of their group. And trying to not do that. So like Christians probably don't, Westboro Baptist or extreme Christian nationalists, like when you equate that to Christianity, that's very frustrating for Christians, and it's not really fair to Christians. Right. Same with atheists. If you judge atheists by the most extreme, angry, anti-theist, yes, there are certainly atheists who are anti-theist and very aggressive and can be quite obnoxious. But the vast majority of atheists, if you really talk to them, they might have frustrations with religion and frustrations about stuff, but they're actually pretty chill if you actually talk to them, right? And so it's taking that time to avoid those stereotypes makes for much healthier conversations.
Yes.
So a question we ask all of our guests every episode is a funny one, and I'm guessing we already know if you're atheist, but you put agnostic next to it, so maybe there's something there. Where do you personally think that we go when we die?
So honestly, for me, I kind of think it's just when you fall asleep and you have a dreamless sleep, that's just kind of what I assume happens.
That's it.
That's kind of just that's what I assume happens. But I have no idea. Sometimes I'll read things about reincarnation and the things that little kids know, and I'm like, maybe reincarnation is a thing. That'd be so fascinating. I don't really necessarily believe in a heaven-hell situation, especially, but I'm going to say, I don't know. I'm going to live this life assuming that's the only one I get, and try to be as kind to people and leave it as good as I can. And if there's something more after, awesome. If not, I'll just, as long as I leave a life that I'm proud of, if some God sends me to hell, it's not a God I would have wanted to worship anyway. So that's kind of how I view it.
That's such a common answer. If God's sending me to hell, then so be it. Sounds like a bad person. But anyways, or God, I guess.
Thing I was going to say just from potential edit is you were talking about the Church of Satan, and I think you were talking about the Satanic Temple, and those are two very different groups. Them. So you might want to just make a quick
I always swap them.
Yep, easy to
do.
Where can people find your articles? Where can people find your discourses online? If people want to learn more, how can they get more information?
Yeah, you can always look up my profile on the University of South Dakota's website. My contact information is there. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always open to conversations. I have several articles that are published on the website, The Conversation, which are shorter articles. I think I have 4 up there. My other scholarly articles, you just look up my name on Google Scholar and look up theist normativity or Christian nationalism or atheist alongside my name. They will all pop up. If you can't access them, you can always feel free to email me, and I'm happy to send you copies if you want to read them. But yeah, those are probably the best ways.
And I'm also going to link them in the description below.
Perfect.
For the ones that you've sent us. So that's another one. I really, as a Christian, read them and felt very informed and thankful that you wrote them, because they were they're good. They're really well written. So thank you for doing that. But also, thank you so much for reaching out to us. This was a very, very good conversation, and I'm so thankful for your time that you gave to us and our audience to talk about this conversation, and really emphasizing empathy between both atheists and the religious community, because it's clearly necessary. And so, thank you so much.
Yes.
Well, I just want to say thank you all for starting this podcast. It's one that I definitely will refer to people. This one, and there's another one called A Killjoy's Guide to Religion, that are my 2 go-to interfaith conversation ideas. And so I'm so glad that y'all exist, so that I can have a resource that I can give people when they're tired of hearing my voice from my students.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you everybody that is listening right now, and we will catch you guys on the next episode. Bye.
Bye.
Have you guys checked out our merch yet?
We have awesome t-shirts, mugs, tumblers, and other fun stuff.
Head down to the link in the description to give it a look.